right, I think I'm going to hand off now to Rachel from the Inner Loop. This is a partnership event with the Inner Loop and their Authors Corner. So I'll let her take the reins and talk to us a little bit about that.
Thank you so much, Emily. For those of you who don't know the Inner Loop, we are also a local literary arts nonprofit to DC, and we cultivate and promote the distinctive literary culture of DC through all kinds of programming. We have monthly readings, a podcast, a summer residency program, and we do retreats twice a year for local writers. And then we also have our Authors Corner program, which this event is a part of. And Authors Corner is a publicity campaign for local authors who have published with a small to medium-sized press. And we spotlight them across all of our programming and in all kinds of community collaborations. We make sure their book is for sale at independent bookstores and the local public library, and otherwise just promote writers who have recently published with independent presses. So if you've never heard of us, please check us out. The link is in the chat, and hopefully you can join us for some upcoming events. Our next reading is June 18th, which is a pretty special aspect of the Inner Loop. It's kind of what everything surrounds. So if you're local, please join us for that. And without further ado, I will hand it over to our lovely poets for the evening to take over.
Hello. Hi, thank you. Thank you to the Writers Center, to Zach and Emily for facilitating this reading and chat. Thank you as well to Rachel and everyone at Inner Loop. Thank you as well to our audience, who are very welcome to ask questions, and we will respond to them as best as we can as the chat continues. Amanda.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Shall we kick it off?
Yeah, so I actually, first of all, this do what you can to support the Inner Loop. I cannot believe the how wonderful this program has been. It's really hard to have a book with a tiny press in terms of having to promote it yourself. So I'm just so lucky. They do everything they say they're going to do, and it's just been a wonderful experience. And it's really, especially coming the month after I had a launch, because I was just so tired and the idea of having to promote it myself. But they're having a fundraiser, so make sure you go. And also the Writer Center is pretty dear to me. I can easily say it's the reason that I have a book out. So, and then I asked Majda to kick us off by reading, because I am so grateful to her for all the time and energy she's put into both reading my book and devising these questions, organizing this chat with me. She spent a lot of time. And she has a chapbook out, and which won the Two Sylvias. Which award is it, Majda?
It's just called the Chapbook Prize. Yeah.
And you have a book coming out when is that? Also won an award?
May of next year, the Wandering Angus Book Prize. Yeah. So hopefully May or April of next year. But this is about you. So
it's always about everyone.
It's about everyone. I love how you're deflecting. We've discovered that we poet really well together. So I'm excited to be here and to talk about your book and about Lily Press, which I think has just been like a huge discovery for me as well, by learning about them through you and through reading your book. But I will just read a short poem since you asked. The first poem in my book, The Call of Paradise. And the opening poem is Pastoral in the Anthropocene. You've walked through the open gate of your country hotel, accompanied by moths and the spectacular air flowing across the night damp grass. It is twilight, yet all the silhouettes make sense. The hour full of dogs walking with their humans. White hairs pause on the edge of dark vision. They allow your passage and stand still. You thank them for not seeing you as predator, as stoat, fox, or kite. Across the road is a field felled of a tree. Crows still flock to its absence for shelter in the indistinguishable night. The quiet they sit with is the quiet of a world stripped of its old gods. That the world should end like this. Amanda, my first question for you is, well, the first thing I'll say is thank you for writing the poems, and it will have been so beautiful. Thank you for assembling the book. To me, it is a book of raging curiosity and of fierce tenderness that spans the quotidian and the interstellar. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and how this came to be?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am 49 years old, so I've been working on this book for a while. The last 15 years is what it covers. And so it's an interesting span. It's not in chronological order, but it certainly has poems that are from 15 years ago and then poems that were written about a year ago. And I have a wonderful editor who really just believed in my work and felt that my voice should be out in the world. And so I'm very grateful to her. Her name is Eileen Cleary, and yes, Lily is a lovely press. Very lucky to be part of it. As for me, well, I mean, I could give you an endless answer, or I could give you the short answer, which is that I was born in New Hampshire. I currently live in DC, and I've lived in a lot of different places in between, and the collection's a lot about that. Particularly, I've lived in Italy, and my husband is from Switzerland. So there's a lot of influence of what it's been like to exist in a different country's culture in the book. And then I think the most important thing about me is that I have been a teacher for a long time, and I am very excited about having this book out there because it means that I get to really start looking at poetry again as something that I can help people come into, and having my own voice out there, just being welcomed into this larger community has also been just wonderful. So I'm happy to be here.
When you were teaching, Amanda, did you teach poetry?
So I taught poetry as a high school teacher. I taught high school for about 7 years, and I taught high school English, obviously, and I incorporated poetry into it. That is something that can go really wrong. And for many people, unfortunately, it did go wrong in their own education. But in my experience, it's really something that is very empowering when students start to appreciate it, and appreciate it on many levels, and feel that it's their own. So that I stopped teaching high school full time in about 2007, and then since then I've taught ESL. I taught in Italy. So it's been a while since I've been able to teach poetry, and I'm really excited to have the chance to go back to that.
I would love to take any class that you teach when it comes to poetry or even writing in general, because And we are going to hear some poems. This is definitely there is a reading portion, but we have to talk about the entirety of the book and as much as we can in this hour. And we need to introduce you to and your ethos, your prosody, your poetics, your aesthetics to the group. So one thing I'll say that I really, as you've said, you've lived a lot of places, and that expresses itself really beautifully in the book. And your passion as an educator, I know that that will continue to flourish in your life, but you decided after living in so many places that you were going to get an MFA, and you went to Warren Wilson.
I did. Are you asking about the decision to do that?
Yeah, I know. I think that how did you feel going from being a teacher to student, especially with something like poetry? What did you learn in that process?
Yeah, I mean, so when you teach, you're in front of people. You're sort of the center of attention. You can try to make it less the case, and I do believe in a student-centered classroom, but you're still, up there. In grad school, particularly because Warren Wilson is a low residency program, you're just one of many, and you have the chance to work one-on-one with wonderful poets who are all feeling the desire to get better as poets. A lot of the technical elements of poetry that we are exposed to, that was interesting for me because I already had a pretty solid foundation in grammar, which is important in poetry, and literary terms. I taught AP English, and the entire curriculum is helping to find to consider what an author does rather than the work itself, why the author makes decisions about the literary elements of the work at hand, and why is that important. So really, it was the best decision I made. I mean, I think I got to a point where I was like, I'm either going to stop writing or I'm going to take this as what I do, because it's very hard to be in the middle. And so I was lucky enough to get into Warren Wilson. I was lucky enough to have a very supportive husband who really believed that that was a way for me to flourish in, I'd been in just a sort of, kind of a holding pattern. So yes, I came from sort of being self-taught, as I think most of us do. But for me, through the research that I was doing to be a teacher, and through all of the reading I've always done. And this was really a wonderful chance to just let my own writing have a window, like the ones I was asking people to give to other work, other people's work. And the wonderful thing about it is that when you're writing, you have to write every day. There are deadlines. You have to write, and you come up with good work. It's inevitable. If you're looking that carefully at others' work, if you're looking that carefully at these craft decisions that other people have made, it's just living in your head. So that, really very much strengthened my work. I was pretty, for example, line breaks. I was just sort of like, oh, I'll just hit return here. And now I'm very careful and very particular about line breaks. It's something I change a lot in revision. So that's just one example.
I know I'm going to ask you further down the line, not too further down the line, to talk about play and poetry and some of the wit in the book. But let me ask you, what is something you do within your work that you haven't had the chance to talk about yet?
Well, I'm gonna get the chance to talk about a lot of it as we continue to talk. We, you know, I think that Majda and I talked about these questions, and I think I was going to, if we have time, share a poem that shows this more satirical and playful element of my work that really also was nourished in, I worked with Gabby Calvacaresi, and I remember her saying, you're really funny. And I was like, I'm funny, like, you know, like I'm not, believe me, I'm not. But I was able to give my natural ear for absurdity, I think, and interest in critique through irony and satire. I was able to let that play, and that definitely did a lot for the work because it enabled me to change the tone here and there of the book. And we'll see if we can get to that last poem that it's called Past Perfect, and it's a poem that my publisher put up on the website, their website, on the Lily website. And it's interesting because it is one of the last poems that I wrote before I put the book together, and I think it's very different. But I do think that I have that element of humor and satire that I am allowing to come out more, and that we really haven't talked that much about in the conversations I've had in the past. But I know you had some specific questions about some poems so that we can kind of give everyone a sense of what I'm writing, since we didn't start with a reading.
Well, yeah, I definitely want to hear some poems.
Yeah. So where should we start?
Well, we can, okay.
Let me just say, Majda is such a careful reader of this book that I have ideas, but I just feel like I'm in such good hands that I'd like to hear from her about what she wants to hear from the book, because she read it so beautifully and carefully.
Oh, thank you. No, I mean, it is a beautiful book. It says so, it says it will have been so beautiful. And it covers so much ground in terms of like of being human. And it's almost like I can't do it I really just won't be able to do it justice. I could, review it right now, but I won't. But in my reading of it, I was really drawn into the sequence of poems about the mountains. And of course, this isn't a coincidence. You're from New Hampshire, your husband is from Switzerland. There are mountains in both these places. So there's this sort of grounding that occurs in the poems about mountains in your work. And also the way that life can be unpredictable. I'm thinking about the poem about the mountain village in Italy, Tormino, which you won't read.
Terremoto, yeah,
Terremoto.
which is the Italian word for earthquake. Yeah,
Yeah.
there was an earthquake in central Italy, not far from Rome, in a town called Amatrice, and it stuck with me for a while. An image that I saw of a nun, in the aftermath of a nun holding a cell phone, and it's such an Italian thing that you don't think about, that there are nuns everywhere, there are monks everywhere. I saw a monk rollerblading across this wide avenue. So, but yeah, I mean, that there's a lot in the book about the destructive power of humans towards the earth and the destructive power of the earth towards humans.
Yes. And you are very fair. And that's why I thought it would be great to hear the sequence of, there's 3 poems titled These Mountains. And would you read from them? Read the first one.
Yeah, I'll start out with the first one, which is the 3rd poem in the book, actually.
Page 7, if you have the book. Yeah.
So
And
the
did you want me to drop some links along the way when you read?
Yeah, I prepared as a teacher, I prepared some links, you know, and even a little document, but maybe if you have the one about Eloise, and I'll just go. So the first poem of the Mountains series, they're dispersed throughout the book, is about my first time in the Alps with my husband towards the very beginning of our relationship. And it was a life-changing event in a lot of ways. If you see the Alps and you've never seen them before, and you see them in the winter and the night, and you know, they're just like this incredible jagged you know, thing of white. And so this poem is about the first time that I went there with my husband, not my husband yet, and it's set in Lausanne, Switzerland. And there is a museum there that I refer to, that Masha's just dropped the link into. So this is called These Mountains 1. In the Cathedral of Lausanne, what Europe couldn't give me is caught in the picture I hoped you'd take, but didn't. Young woman, pale at the altar, gaze cast down like the doves, translucent rose watering the stone behind. Below were lakes too large to lose their blue, the clipped fists of plane trees in winter, and the Musée de l'Art Brut, where you showed me Aloise's love affairs in crushed petals and toothpaste, the paysage alpestre of the Appenzeller orphan, master of the UHT carton, and the terrified horse assembled from sticks and brambles. Europe was cold. I'd brought the wrong coat. In your mother's, I grinned, tongue thick in my Anglophone mouth, all tufts and peakless rounds each time you tried a portrait. On the way to Montana, a state I thought green and cradling, the craggy valleys and slopes we climbed and climbed scathed the unseen from my mind. You took me from your grandparents' house to the edge to hear the Swiss village quaking softly below, its glacial pace unruffled by the heights. L'Art Brut, I later learned, Americans call by a gentler name, outsider. We're wrong. The twisted twigs that cried out hoarse, the masks of red rag and yarn, the luminous, cramped manuscripts, a flame of tongues sharp as mountains in the brute January night. Last week, some old urge waked in you, and you insisted. Amanda in thought, in rain, in Michigan, a state without hills for miles and miles. The camera is a manageable fate. That first ghost image of your rag and yarn girl, your Eloise, muffled in a rush of down. Look for it now, you'll find I erased it long ago. What remains? Your country without euphemism. Your funicular, perched, spired country. The place you'd keep me if I fell. So we'll go on. We did put the link in there. That museum is fascinating. The terminology for outsider art is also very interesting. So definitely look it up. But that was my first trip, and the epigraph, the first epigraph to the book comes from Wallace Stevens, and it originally used to be what appeared before that poem. Mountains do make up the spine of the book. And that's why I put these poems in throughout the book. And there are 3, but there's also, as Majda said, there's work that incorporates mountains as well in other parts. The second poem, and if you have questions about that one, please, about what I just read, please, we'll come back to it probably, but do drop them in, because there's a lot of visual art in there that sometimes is hard to grasp in a reading.
Yeah, but can I say something about
Yeah.
the
Oh, yeah,
poem?
absolutely. Go ahead, please.
It's in couplets. And we were talking about line breaks earlier. You were saying something that when you were at Warren Wilson, you felt that you had the time to really, you weren't just hitting return. Well, that's very evident here. But I mean, I think that's the first instinct that a poet has when you write poetry. You have to cut the line. You're not writing prose.
Mhm.
So there is definitely an instinct to it. And I'm sure that you had it. But I really, in this poem, These Mountains One, I'm admire the couplets, the line breaks, and I especially love the way that you move from mountains to mountains, from Switzerland to Montana. And
Mhm.
then you sort of you bring in the art form and then mention it by what America calls it, outsider. And your whole perspective in the poem is as an outsider, and you're an outsider. And it's just so deft the way that you move from, and I think this really illustrates the way that your brain works, and the trust you have in your process when you're writing, is that you link these places without having the trend, with very smooth transitions. You're not juxtaposing anything. It's just these smooth landings through and through and through. And so that's the reason I wanted to talk about These Mountains, because you do that throughout the whole book.
Yeah,
And
and this poem is unusual in the length of the lines. It is couplets, and the lines are quite long. They even were thinking they might have to change the layout of the book for that, but a lot of my poems have, they're longer, but I'll just show you. This one is a more typical, and then this is the poem that I read. So I played around with how that looked on the page. I had it all in one. But in the end, the couplets just moved it along faster, I think. It's a dense line because it's these long lines. And the couplets just felt like they would give a reader more time to process. I think, in terms of craft, I definitely do a lot instinctively, and it's hard to identify, why that particular, but I definitely did want to, this poem just felt better. Um, for example, on the way to Montana, a state I thought green and cradling, that felt like a line that could be 2 lines, but I also really like, and I think there's some people who won't, this is a technical term, but I also really love the caesura. And because I use the caesura is, when you have a break in a line of poetry, with a comma or a period or some kind of punctuation mark. I always find it very powerful when you have a long line that flows and then you get to another long line, but you have a break in the middle. And I always wanted, I think, to do that. And so there's a moment in this where I have two caesura, and that felt really just, it felt like it completely changed the rhythm of the poem in a way that could be powerful and call attention to it. I don't
so
know
let
if
me
you hear it, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, there's some questions in the chat, but I was just going to ask
Oh, please do.
if you read, because your poems are very musical and sound like very natural, like the way
The prose.
I've read them out loud.
Yeah.
Do you read them out loud when you're writing them?
Not when I'm writing them. You know, I certainly read them out loud at some point. But I think I've gotten to the point, and this has always been somewhat true for me, but I've gotten to the point where the music is entirely in my head. I think I've just read so much poetry over the years and read poetry in meter, in, you know, in more traditional forms. But yeah, a line just tends to sing in my head, and then I'll read it to find out if it flows, really, not so much for the sound. But I do know that my poems are very sonic. I'm very interested in sound and patterns of sound. So you'll get that a lot. I think I don't write prose poems. Somebody was asking about that. Majda does. I've just not really, it's the kind of thing where I haven't studied it, and I'm not sure I have it, because my poems do tend to be pretty narrative. And I think when you've got that prosy kind of story to tell, you don't want to do it in prose. You want to do it in a poem so that the poetry can exist in a way that I think in These Mountains too, which I was going to read, I'm going to read, you see the balance when you write a lot of narrative. And Majda and I have been talking all along about the importance of accessibility in poetry. And she and I both believe very strongly that poetry can speak to everyone, and that one of the ways in which I learned to do that was to have it tell a story and mix in the narrative elements with the lyric elements. So should I read the second? Okay, so this one is also called These Mountains. It appears later in the book. And hold on, I lost it on my screen, so I've just got to get it back here. I will read it from the book because that'll be faster than trying to get it back on my screen. I think it's on page, do you know, Majda? 56? Okay, if you have the book, it's on page 56. These Mountains, too. And this poem is set in an area of France called Auvergne. And there's a series of volcanoes. There's a chain of volcanic mountains. And they're not mountains the way that the Alps are, but they're definitely mountains the way that we think of mountains when we're not in the Rockies. They're about 1,500 feet, but they are dormant volcanoes. So this is called These Mountains too. It is too hot, the innkeeper had warned us. His English precise, except for the word for les moucherons, the pests that haunt the salt-rich springs and pilgrims seeking restoration of their weakened lungs. Unprepared tourists, we walked up a ski trail to get to the top of the idol dome, the dust and sharp grade making me listless, making the blisters more irksome, making gravity personal, vindictive. I could have run up such a slope in better times. Little mountain goat, Greg said, on our first visits to the Alps. The grass at the top seemed new enough, seemed altogether placid. I looked and looked, just grass. The French picnicked and scowled, children whined. What was I supposed to feel? Clermont's famed cathedral, made of tuff, had just looked black, as though grime had broken down white marble or stone. Up there, amid the midges and wild carrot, Greg told me about the layers of time I couldn't see, the remnants of fervent lava streams beneath the green furrows and uneven strips of rock. Midges, black flies, gnats, whatever the tongue called them, they sought our hollows, entered nose and mouth. 13 million years ago, the porous earth broke and heaved trails of molten rock, leaving the ridges where we sat watching the flow of pilgrims in shorts, batting at the buzzing clouds. That evening, in Riom, the small flies gone, we sat on the hotel balcony looking out in the milder air over velvet peaks, pyroclastic spires, and the hot earth's furious fault lines, line of tired climbers, line of fire cooled to leisure. This human reach, these earthly expirations.
Well, I'm just over here swooning over pyroclastic spires. I have the ending sort of bracketed out. It's just so beautiful. I keep using that word. I wonder why. There was a question that I think really applies to the poems that you've been reading. Catherine asked if you consider your book to be eco writing.
Yeah. Well, every poem is about climate change to one degree. I mean, you can hear that with the first one, not so much because it was not on my mind. But I definitely, climate change is a major subject of the book. It's where the title comes from, the sense that we are not aware in the moment of what we have. And in looking back, perhaps we'll be aware because of what we've lost. And so it's kind of a plea to say, we've got it now, please, please look at it. It is beautiful. But I think that eco-poetry, I'm not sure how people define it. I certainly write about climate and the earth, so it certainly is eco-poetry. But I think a lot of times when people talk about eco-poetry, they're talking more about somebody walking through nature and kind of communing with it, and climate change is imbued in that and the sadness over it. But I think mine is much more about these huge timelines, right? The Alps are just so old, and there were these violent moments in the Earth's history that just really fascinate me, but also make me, just make me feel more. My insignificance helps me out, let's just say, in those moments. Because there's, in the first poem, there's a lot about alienation. In the second poem, there's a lot about alienation. And a lot of it is just feeling like I'm not enough against these huge forces. But the reason there are these mountains poems is that the third is very much about finding a home. It's about being up in a hot air balloon and floating over the Alps. And I'm with my husband's family, my family, and I'm Swiss, and so the alienation that comes in the first poem is, less so in the second. And then by the third, it's really my home. And so I think that, when people look at these mountains poems, that's really the arc of the book, but always through the natural world.
It is really just so well done, because there's the mountains obviously are so vulnerable in this time of climate change, and you show us that. And then you show us this journey through for people who haven't read the book yet. There are some fantastic poems about the journey of, heavenly heavenly bodies that orbit, in space. So there's really these beautiful poems about moons, and the moon plays out there a lot.
Would you
There's a
call
quote.
it eco poetry?
Well, what is eco poetry these days? Because
I know that's the hard thing.
there's Mary Oliver. I would definitely think of her as someone, she was out there every day with a notebook, and she was transcribing what she saw. So a lot of people think that is eco poetry, but she also buries a message in it. And there's a movement in eco poetry right now where you only transcribe. You transcribe the cruelty and you transcribe the beauty. You're like an anthropologist and you're back here observing. And that isn't as appealing as what you do in this book, which is, you're saying that you're human. You're in the process of becoming human. You wish things were better, but so deep in your heart, in your soul, to your soul, because it's been shown to you time and time again by nature that this is a beautiful place to be. And I'm summarizing, and I hate to do that, but it honestly, all of these messages are so carefully buried that you sort of don't even realize it, because you're just on this, it's like a pilgrimage. The book is a pilgrimage. So let me put it to you that way. And those pilgrims come up in poems. So I would say, quite honestly, that you have eco poetics going on in the book. You have narrative, lyricism, and honestly, a lot of play, a lot of it, a lot of wordplay, banter, self-deprecation, feminism. There's so much ground to cover. Do you want to talk a little bit though about wordplay, where we discovered bondies, or anything else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you there's a poem called Heart Poetica, and it is pretty different. And it puzzled a friend of mine, even though she'd read my work very beautifully. And Majda went right to it, in part because it's called Heart Poetica. And of course, when you have an Ars Poetica in there in the book, you're doing something, you're making a declaration. And this poem I was just writing pretty much constantly during the MFA program. And this one just kind of came out. And it is, I will show again, it is very different on the page. It's just these very short kind of lines that and I will read it now. It begins with an epigraph from Hamlet, which I also prepared for people to look up if they would like, but I'll read the poem first. The epigraph is, "It is as easy as lying. Look, these are the stops. Flower of vitriol, flower of frostbite, you'd play upon this organ heart. Rabbit heart, pigeon heart, cotton heart, twine. Heart grub, heart mite, lipstick, swine. You tendril, you vine heart, you blood blight, love bite, but you can't make it sing. I am hard, murmur heart, beat, line. Can't live with you, will you or won't you? Daisy heart, seed heart, rag heart, mine." So Masha, if you can talk about talk about why you wanted me to pick that poem.
Well, it's okay, it's beautiful. The other thing is, that the language is very, show this as best as I can now that Mike the cat has wandered away and you're not getting tail. It is extremely compressed and stripped down to these very descriptive words. It's full of caesura in the page.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that you would probably open up in a book of Elizabethan poetry and see. And it hugely impressed me. And so I had to talk to, because I'm just a word geek that way. But it's, it's an accessible poem because it's so beautiful in the mouth when you read it out loud. How did you edit this? Did you edit it for spondies?
So we were talking, I refer to an IM in it, and an IM is just that little, for poets out there, it's, you'll know what it is, but it is the two syllables where the second is stressed. English is a very stress heavy language. So the basic pattern of English speech is iambic. And when I was teaching, I used the example sentence, Amanda said she'd like to buy a book. Amanda said she'd like to buy a book, right? So it's every other. And so I said, I am hard, in part because it's a play on I am, right? But it's also, it's what Shakespeare uses. So I'm referencing Shakespeare, whatever it is, but it is also, people will say, the heartbeat, the dot, the dot, the dot, the dot, ba 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 ba, right? So given that it's a poem about the heart and the poetry, it just kind of popped to mind. And the other interesting thing that I looked back at is that I have this murmur heart, and I was born with a heart murmur. It closed pretty quickly. It was fine, but it was always something where you're born with something that is not normal, right? And so this poem is very much where a lot of poems that are not as, lyrical in the book or symbolic. It's what I discovered is that I could be a little more angry, if you will, a little more claiming something, that last part, mine. I also just really love sound play, and it was fun to use these. But as Majda and I were looking at the poem, we realized that I don't think there's a single I am in that poem. It tends to be mostly what are called spondies, and a spondee is two stressed syllables, one after the other. And that's in part because I use a lot of compound words. But it's an uncomfortable, when we talk, we rarely do two stressed syllables, unless we're using like a compound word. Gerard Manley Hopkins does a lot of them, and his book, his poems are very kind of jerky, but again,
it's
to
called
me,
sprung rhythm when
he had his
Hopkins does
own.
it. Yeah, so you created your own rhythm here.
In part, but not intentionally. But then ones that are not spondies are dactyls, which is the opposite of the IM. We're really getting into the craft here. But so flower, frost bite, right? Flower is the dactyl, dot, dot. And then rabbit, pigeon. And I just kept doing that. And I think that was just because that was the what sounds, made sense. I was playing with them. And then this heart, grub, heart, mite. It's really hard to do that in just like syllabic speech. But it really changes the way you hear something. In that it gives a different emphasis. It's kind of like all caps in a text, right? Or, it's like, hear me, right? And so I think that that's where that kind of ended up being the predominant unit of meter in there. So.
It's so interesting. If I were to assign a prompt, I would say, look at this poem, Heart Poetica on page 64, craft wise, and try to do something like this where you're use anger or some sort of grounding emotion and really claim the language, and you use compound words or kennings, they used to be called, I think, in the old Anglo-Saxon, because this can come across as so inaccessible when you're learning, when you're like, I was so intimidated by sonnets that I now I just could write them every day, but it took me like 10 years, it took me like 10 years to feel that comfort. It's just comfort. You think that if you don't sound like Shakespeare right away, that you can't write a sonnet, and that's just not true. So what's important to me really is that, and I think to the audience, they should know this, there's a lot of play in It Will Have Been So Beautiful. It's self-deprecating, it's discovery. Do you want to read the Don Lemon poem?
Well, we only have about 5 minutes left. I don't know if the Writing Center needs to end this. It is, it is a poem. I wrote a poem called Past Perfect, and it's in the book. And I was very angry about Don Lemon calling Nikki Haley not in her prime. I don't know if any of you remember that, but he got fired for it. God knows if he got hired again and then fired again, I don't know. But the poem is kind of a play on that. And, I like grammar, I like tenses. So it will have been so beautiful, and then past perfect, right? And the idea of being past the point of perfection. I have a lot of poems where I'm just playing with the language, and then find the depth there, right? I think that's important for people to play, because as you play, you're going to find that there's something deeper in there that you really, that it's going to emerge because you're a little more loose about it. You're a little more letting things in that you don't necessarily associate with poetry. And I think, one of the great things that I was able to do with a book, rather than individual poems published here and there, was to vary what I could put in it. So I have the poem with the long lines. I have the poem with the shorter lines. I have a lot of poems that are kind of have laddered lines where you indent and then indent and then indent. And, I was conscious of just trying to give the reader a place to pause, because the early poems can be and a lot of the poems can be very sad, right? Intense, and it's, when I was younger, I was a little afraid to be angry. And yet I feel that the anger can come out in poetry in a way. At first I was worrying that playing around or using cliche, flippantly, would be superficial or would come across as too glib. But I'm leaning into that, and it really is very freeing. I'm not being shrill.
No, not at all.
I'm just going out there. We had a question in Dara's asking about English being a stress-heavy language. Yes, I have written somewhat in French and Italian. I mean, I lived in Italy, so I'm, and as an English teacher for a second language, Romance language speakers do not really stress. Like French in particular has a very even keeled, there's not a lot of stress, but English it exists. When I teach my students how to pronounce things, I was like, you just gotta go with the stress and it'll make it easier for people to understand you. If you're stressing the right thing, then they have something to hold on to. And so I've just paid a lot of attention to that over time, and how stresses work and how much impact a stress in one place has as opposed to a stress in another. Not just when you're reading out loud, but obviously reading out loud has a lot to do with the effect that you get. But it's wonderful. You can just say, okay, I have this very kind of boring rhythm going on. How can I change it? Well, throw in a spondy, throw in some kind of compound word that is going to make people stop and sort of recalibrate. because that is what happens with the ear and the eye. I don't know, we are running over. So Emily, are we, we're about at the end here. Oh. Hi.
You have like a couple more minutes if you wanted
Okay.
to read the poem.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely, I'll read it. So it's called Past Perfect, as I said. It's on page 53. You have the book, and this poem is, you know, different. I mean, the book has a lot of different kinds of poems, and this one, it's very much along the lines of that more saucy, whoop, angry person. Past Perfect. An oleaginous rainbow floats in the heat on puddles in the Safeway lot. Anchor no more. Don Lemons muddled his cocktail a bit too long. If I'm honest, Don implies you're not. I've curated this body for mirrors. My feet are hot. I want something sweet. The flies are buzzing for rot. Thank you. So as we're winding down, are there any other, oh, thank you, Dara. So Emily, why don't we I just wanted to say quickly that my editor would be very frustrated with me if I did not say I'm reading at the Grolier, a couple of other Lily authors are reading at the Grolier, and it is a hybrid event. And so it would be wonderful if we had people who can go, you know, who are interested in that reading. The Grolier is the oldest consistently existing poetry bookstore in the country, and so it's a very important, lovely place, and it's a real honor to be reading there. And then, you know, if you're curious about anything else, just feel free to just, you know, follow Instagram or whatever. I've got my socials in order. So yeah, so I think that's it. I mean, unfortunately, we can't get to all the questions, but yes, the Grolier is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but it's an online hybrid event.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Majda, for
Thank you.
facilitating. And thank you all for joining us this evening with this chat. Please, please, please buy books if you're able, request them for your library. We're here to support our authors this evening, so do that in any way that you can. And please keep in touch with all the good things happening with us at the Writer Center and the Inner Loop. Lots more to come between this partnership as well. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday evening.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Oh, I have to see everyone. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Have a good evening.